Imagine waking up one morning and half your neighbors are dead. Not from war, not from famine, from something you cannot see. Something carried on the skin of fleas, living on the backs of rats, moving through your streets like a shadow that never lifts. This was Europe in 1347, and by the time it was over, nothing would ever be the same again. The plague arrived at the port of Messina in October 1347, carried by Genoese trading ships returning from the Black Sea. The sailors who stepped off those ships were already dying. Their bodies were covered in black swellings the size of apples. Blood seeped from their noses, their mouths, the sockets of their eyes. Within days, the infection had spread to the dockworkers. Within weeks, it had reached the city. The bacterium responsible was Yersinia pestis, a microscopic organism that thrived inside the digestive system of fleas. Those fleas lived on black rats, and those rats lived everywhere, in your grain stores, under your floorboards, inside the walls of your home. You had no idea any of this was happening. What you knew was this: people around you started to shiver, then came the fever. Then the lumps, hard, dark, swollen nodes in the neck, the armpits, the groin. Doctors called them buboes from the Greek word for groin. The name stuck. This was the bubonic plague, and it killed you in 3 to 5 days. If the bacteria reached your lungs, you developed pneumonic plague, a form that spread through coughing and breathing. That version could kill in a single day. There was no treatment, no understanding of what caused it, no concept of infection as we understand it today. Your doctor might prescribe bloodletting or lancing the buboes or burning aromatic herbs to purify the surrounding air. None of it worked. Norwegian historian Ole Benedicto spent decades reconstructing the demographics of the plague. His landmark 2004 study calculated that the Black Death killed approximately 60% of Europe's entire population. 6 out of every 10 people. In some regions, the death rate climbed even higher. Entire villages were abandoned overnight. Fields went unplowed. Livestock wandered without owners. Mills stopped turning. Churches fell silent. You have to picture the scale of what that means. Every second person you have ever known, gone. Your wife, your neighbor, the blacksmith, the priest who baptized your children, the midwife who delivered them, all gone in the span of weeks. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, living through the plague in Florence, described what he witnessed in his introduction to the Decameron. He wrote that the disease was so contagious that merely touching the clothes of the sick could transmit it. He described families abandoning each other, fathers refusing to see their own children. He described the dead piled in the streets, loaded onto carts, and carried to mass graves with no ceremony, no prayers, and no mourners. You have to understand, this was a world where death was supposed to be a ritual, a sacred passage. A priest was supposed to give you last rites. Your body was supposed to be washed, wrapped, and buried in consecrated ground near the church. The plague stripped all of that away. People died faster than they could be buried. In many cities, the churchyards overflowed. In London, excavations at East Smithfield in the 1980s uncovered a mass plague cemetery where bodies were stacked in layers, sometimes 5 deep, with no coffins, no shrouds, and no markers. The chronicler Jean de Venette, writing in France, described the plague as a punishment from God. He was not alone in this belief. Across Europe, the dominant explanation was divine wrath. People had sinned, and God was purging the world. Some joined processions of flagellants, groups of penitents who walked from town to town, whipping their own backs with leather straps studded with iron spikes, begging God's forgiveness in public. They bled in the streets and sang hymns and believed their suffering would end the plague. The church eventually condemned these movements, but the desperation they reflected was real and widespread. What happened next is the part that most people miss. The plague did not just kill, it shattered the entire social structure of medieval Europe. Before 1347, Europe operated under a rigid feudal system. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant. You worked your lord's land, you paid your tithes to the church. You had almost no freedom to leave the manor where you were born. There were more laborers than there was land to work. That meant lords had all the power. If you refused the terms, there was always someone else desperate enough to accept them. The plague inverted that equation overnight. When half the population died, the survivors suddenly held something precious: their labor. English manorial court rolls from the decades after 1348 reveal landlords desperately trying to hold on to workers. They offered better plots of land. They reduced obligations. They waived fees that had been collected for generations. Wages rose sharply. Peasants who had never traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace began to move, seeking better deals, better land, better lives. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, a law designed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers. It was a direct response to the new bargaining power that survivors held. The law was widely ignored. Workers left anyway. Some lords quietly paid above the legal wage because they had no choice. Historian Samuel K. Cohn, Jr., of the University of Glasgow, studied the social aftermath of the plague across Italian city-states and found something remarkable. In the decades after the Black Death, there was a measurable increase in literacy among working people, a growing demand for luxury goods among former laborers, and a clear rise in social mobility. The old hierarchies did not collapse overnight, but they cracked. And they never fully repaired. Think about what that means. The deadliest catastrophe in recorded European history, a disease that killed tens of millions of people, also became the event that loosened the grip of feudalism. The labor shortage gave peasants bargaining power they had never possessed in 1,000 years. It accelerated the decline of serfdom. It laid the groundwork, centuries later, for the emergence of a middle class and the eventual restructuring of European economies. The church was also transformed. Before the plague, the church was the unquestioned moral and spiritual authority of European life. Its rituals governed everything from birth to death. But its priests died at the same rate as everyone else, in some regions higher because they were obligated to visit the sick and administer last rites. The loss of trained clergy meant replacements were often poorly educated and sometimes corrupt. Public trust wavered. People began asking questions they had never dared to ask. Why had God allowed this? Why had prayers and processions failed? Why had the holiest communities, monasteries, convents, suffered as badly as anyone? Some historians, including Benedicto, argue that the crisis of faith sown by the Black Death contributed to the intellectual shifts that eventually led to the Reformation 2 centuries later. The seeds of doubt planted in plague graves grew into movements that would split the church permanently. There were darker consequences, too. In many communities, fear turned outward looking for someone to blame. Jewish communities across Europe were scapegoated with horrifying speed. Accusations spread that Jews had poisoned the wells. Entire Jewish communities were massacred in Strasbourg, in Mainz, in Cologne, despite papal declarations that Jews were dying from the plague at the same rate as Christians and had no connection to the disease. The historian David Nirenberg has documented how plague-era anti-Jewish violence became one of the most intense and devastating waves of persecution in medieval European history. Fear does not make people rational. It makes them dangerous. And the plague did not come just once. It returned in waves, in 1361, 1369, 1374, and repeatedly for the next 300 years. Each wave killed fewer people because survivors carried some degree of genetic resistance. But each wave reminded Europe of one brutal truth, that the systems people relied on, food supply, law, religion, family, could collapse in weeks, that the world was fragile, that normal was temporary. Here is the part that should keep you up at night. Yersinia pestis has not disappeared. It still exists. Cases are reported every year in the western United States, in Madagascar, in parts of Central Asia and South America. Modern antibiotics can treat it if caught early. But the bacterium is still out there, still carried by fleas, still living in rodent populations around the world, still waiting. What separated 1347 from today was not the disease itself. It was the infrastructure to detect it, contain it, and treat it. The Black Death thrived because there was no germ theory, no antibiotics, no quarantine protocols, no public health system, and no understanding of how disease actually traveled from person to person. People blamed miasma, bad air. They blamed divine punishment. They blamed Jews. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about vectors. They did not know that the rats dying in the streets were not a symptom of the plague. They were the first link in the chain that was killing everyone around them. We think of the medieval world as distant, as primitive, as something that could never touch us, but the Black Death was not a failure of medieval people. It was a failure of knowledge, and knowledge is exactly what separates your world from theirs. You wake up in a world with antibiotics, with epidemiologists, with early warning systems and rapid vaccine development and a global network of disease surveillance. You take that for granted every single day. But the infrastructure that protects you, the science, the protocols, the public health institutions, was built piece by piece, on the lessons learned from a catastrophe that no one in 1347 could explain. Half of Europe died so that the other half could begin to question everything. The world you live in, the one with labor rights, with social mobility, with a church that no longer holds absolute temporal authority, was forged in part by a disaster that no one saw coming and no one could stop. The rats were always there. The question was whether anyone was paying attention.